Hi, everyone. Professor Sackett-Taylor here with a series of video lectures for Principles of Microeconomics. This set of video lectures is going to be focusing on the decisions of the firm, specifically firms that operate in what we call a competitive market setting. So this is just a reminder slide, I guess, from the last chapter on costs that take all of those different equations that we were looking at, total costs, average total costs, variable costs, average variable costs, fixed costs, average fixed costs, marginal costs, and it converts them numerically from a table into a graph. And so let's just review this quickly for a second. So in this graph, let's start with the curve that looks kind of like a check mark. That's our marginal cost curve. Now, the marginal cost curve, the first thing we notice is that since we're measuring the quantity of output on the x-axis and the numerical dollar-based cost on the y-axis, the first thing we see is that as we first begin to increase our output, meaning moving from left to right, our marginal cost at first starts to fall, right? And this is because we start to add new inputs. That's how we get more output. And those inputs begin to help us operate more efficiently, right? This is that idea of, I've got a big grill and only one person working on it. So when I add a second person, that grill actually becomes more productive. I can get more out of it. And I add a third person and it becomes even more productive and I get more out of it. And as I do that, my marginal cost, the cost of producing each unit of output, is going to go down because I'm using each of my inputs a little bit more efficiently. However, we know that at some point, diminishing marginal product kicks in. A reminder, diminishing marginal product means that the extra output produced by each additional input begins to decline. So while the inputs are still adding to our overall production, they're adding a smaller and smaller amount. And since we are making an assumption in this model that each input cost is fixed, that they all cost the same, then if we are paying the same amount for each input, but as I add inputs, they're giving me less and less in terms of output, that means that as I continue adding inputs, or as I continue to produce more and more stuff, each unit of output gets a little bit more expensive to make. And so that's why we see at 50, after that point, the marginal cost curve shifts and doesn't shift, but it starts to turn upwards and start to have an increasing impact. And so the cost of producing each additional unit after diminishing marginal product has kicked in goes up and up and up. That's why the marginal cost curve looks like this check shape. That's the one that's the most important to us right now. The other three curves I'd like you to look at just in terms of their relation to one another. Remember, we said that total costs can be broken down into fixed costs and variable costs. Fixed costs are the costs that don't change depending on your output. They stay the same. It's like a lease payment or a loan payment, that it doesn't depend on how much you produce. Whereas variable costs are going to do exactly that. They'll vary based on your output quantity. So when you produce more, variable costs go up. When you produce less, variable costs tend to go down. And so what we do know is that since fixed and variable costs sum up to make total costs, that rule also holds for their averages. So average fixed cost and average variable cost add up to make average total cost. And that's why you can see that average total cost is the highest of these three curves, because it's the sum of the other two curves. All right. So now that we've reviewed a little bit about that graph, let's think about what our goals are for this video lecture. The first is to understand how the format of a competitive market really works. And then within that context, if you're a firm operating in a competitive market, what rules do you need to follow in order to maximize your profits? And finally, we'll draw ourselves back to the supply and demand diagram that we learned at the beginning of the semester and think about how the rules of a competitive market will shape the supply curve, both in the short run and in the long run. So let's start by defining competitive markets. The first thing that is essential for a market to be competitive is there have to be many, many buyers and many, many sellers. Essentially, it's a very busy market with lots of people looking to make transactions. The goods in a perfectly competitive market are very similar. There's not very distinct quality differentiation between them. I think about competitive goods as, there's very little difference between the product produced by different producers of the same thing. Like think about like pencils or sponges, right? Like things where like everyone who produces this thing is pretty much producing the same product. What this means is that the firm is called a price taker. So let's just do like a little thought experiment here. If I'm a firm in a perfectly competitive market, there are lots and lots of other people selling a product that's almost identical to mine. So if I was to charge a higher price than my competitors, I'm really not going to sell very much because there are very close substitutes in the market and the consumers are going to go elsewhere seeking lower prices. If I was to charge less than my competitors, I may get an initial bump of sales, right? People might come to me, but remember, there are lots and lots and lots of buyers in this market. So a single seller can't possibly supply the entire market with this product. So eventually, after that bump, the buyers are going to go elsewhere to your competitors to buy the same product. And because your competitors are selling at a slightly higher price because you tried to undercut them, they're actually going to make more money than you. So you're actually, by trying to undercut your competitor in a perfectly competitive market, you put yourself at a detriment in the long run in that you're going to overall make less profit than the other people in the industry. So it doesn't really make sense to set your price higher or lower than your competitors. This is what it means to be a price taker. It means that every firm in a competitive market is going to charge essentially the same amount. Think about when you go to a grocery store or Staples, I guess, in the case of pencils, right? A pack of pencils, the price on a pack of pencils varies by a very little amount, right? You can pretty much guess what the price of a pack of pencils is going to be, no matter where you get it from or who produced it. Same with sponges, right? That the price is very close. There's not a wild distinction in prices because they're identical and there's lots of people selling them. The last thing that's necessary for a perfectly competitive market is free entry and free exit. And what this means is that the government has not imposed any laws or rules or restrictions on who can sell this good or how much of it they can sell. So this allows individual firms to come in and out of this market as they see fit without having any barriers in place placed by government regulations. Okay, so if and only if we have all of these things happening simultaneously, then we know we're operating in a perfectly competitive market. Let's look at some examples. At first, the stock market seems like a perfectly competitive market. There are millions of shares of stock traded daily, lots of buyers and lots of sellers. The buyers and sellers have access to real-time information, and most of the traders represent only a small share of the market, so they don't have really the ability to influence market price. This means that they're price takers. However, the free entry and free exit situation has been negated. Large institutional investors are big enough to be able to influence who can come in and out of this market and what the dominant price in the market is going to be. And so for this reason, the stock market is actually not perfectly competitive. Let's think about a farmer's market. The sellers are able to set up with little or no cost, so free entry and free exit. There are many buyers and many sellers, of very similar products, which causes the market price to be very similar, right? A zucchini from one stand is going to cost approximately the same amount as a zucchini from another stand. So at first, it looks like these people would be price takers. However, we haven't met the many buyers, many sellers situation perfectly, because in many of these individual regional or local product markets, a single farmer's market doesn't have enough sellers to achieve a perfectly competitive result. If there's so few vendors, so few sellers of a specific good, then an individual seller could often set a higher price in order to meet the supply needed for a local or regional demand. Online ticket auctions. So the resale market for tickets, we're talking about like the, things that where someone buys up tickets and then resells them. These events often involve many buyers and many sellers. The price for the seats in identical sections end up converging quickly within a narrow range. But some ticket companies get special privileges that enable them to buy and sell blocks of tickets at a period of time when others can't. So this prevents free entry and free exit to this market. So it's not perfectly competitive. And finally, if you look internationally and think about currency trading, hundreds of thousands of traders around the globe are buying and selling currency on any given day. But because all the traders have real-time information, the currency trades in a different part of the world actually tend to converge around the same price. But currency markets are often subject to government intervention. They may wish to strategically alter the prevailing price of their currency to offset different economic conditions that are happening domestically within their own country. So again, not free entry, not free exit. There's some limits or barriers set to who is doing this trading. And there's also some power to manipulate prices. So again, not perfectly competitive. It turns out that while we've tried to set up our economy using a capitalist model that promotes what's called a free market or a perfectly competitive market, very few products actually meet all of the criteria for a perfectly competitive market. They may have some characteristics of a competitive market, but not all. And so we have to actually change our models a little bit to understand the decisions of those firms. In this class, for now, at the principles level, we can make assumptions about firms that actually do live in a perfectly competitive market space. So let's use a hypothetical example now. Let's look at a firm called Mr. Plow that provides a service, snow plowing. Mr. Plow wants to maximize profits and wants to derive a rule to follow that would help the owner of this business determine how to use inputs and how much output to produce. So here's a table with all the information that we've done before for Mr. Plow. So let's go column by column. In the far left column, this is a quantity of output, right? So maybe this is like the number of driveways plowed. Okay, in the next column, we've got total revenue. So the assumption here that's listed at the top is that the price of a single plow is $10. And so total revenue is going to be all the money coming in from the sale of his service. And so total revenue is simply the $10 price per driveway times the quantity of driveways. So when I'm plowing 4 driveways, I make $40 in total revenue. When I'm plowing 7 driveways, I make $70 in total revenue. The total cost curve, the total cost here is given to us. So this is information that we're not deriving, but is just put into this table. So remember our first equation from the last chapter, profit. Profit is measured as money coming in, total revenue, minus money going out, total costs. So this green column here takes the total revenue column and subtracts the total cost column. So this number here, 245, oh, I'm sorry, is incorrect. And I should have captured that here. This would be 10 minus 34. So this should be negative 24. And so you can see there are places where profit is negative. This is called a loss. So for a quantity of 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the first 5 driveways plowed are actually incurred at a loss. You don't start to make a profit until the 6th driveway. Now, marginal revenue is the change in total revenue. It's how much extra revenue I get from each plow job, right? And since we are a price taker in a perfectly competitive industry here, marginal revenue is simply equal to the price that I charge for each service. Marginal cost is the change in my total cost. It's how much my total cost goes up for every additional driveway that I plow. And we can see that this table indicates that we do have that check mark shaped marginal cost curve, that at first marginal costs start to drop, but eventually we experience a situation where we have diminishing marginal product, right? The output per input starts to decline, and that's where our marginal costs start to climb. Finally, we can look at our change in profit or our marginal profit. This is going to be the difference between our marginal revenue and our marginal costs. This column on the far right is measuring how much profit is earned on each additional unit. All right, so now let's think about how we might derive a profit maximizing rule. In general, as economists, we like to, quote unquote, think at the margin, meaning we recognize that we can make the best, most informed decisions if we take a really big decision and break it down into its component parts, making one small decision at a time. In this case, I don't want to think about how many driveways do I plow? That's too big of a question. The question really should be, do I plow one more driveway? Take it one at a time. So Mr. Plow, therefore, wants to compare not total revenue and total costs, but marginal revenue and marginal costs. That is, marginal revenue, how much extra money comes in from plowing one more driveway, versus marginal cost, how much money goes out from plowing one additional driveway. So since marginal revenue is our change in total revenue and marginal cost is our change in total cost, we're really looking at just that one unit increase. So our marginal profit will be equal to the difference between what comes in and what comes out on the margin. So the profit maximizing rule should be that for every additional unit, when I decide, do I want to plow one more driveway? Well, that one more driveway should at least bring in as much money as it's costing me to do it, right? If marginal revenue is bigger than marginal cost, it means I'm bringing in more money than the going out. That's a good thing. If marginal revenue is less than marginal cost, it means I'm bringing in less money that's going out. That's a loss. The sweet spot is where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. It's essentially the break-even point. It's where on the next plow job, I bring in exactly the amount of money I need to cover the cost of doing that job. That's the way that I can ensure that everything I've done previously made me a positive profit, and everything that I would do going forward would make me a loss. So that's the stopping point. That's the signal to us, right? Where do I stop plowing? I stop plowing at the driveway that breaks even. So here, if we're looking at the marginal revenue and marginal cost columns, we can see that the first driveway, I bring in $10 and it costs me $9. So that first driveway brings me a marginal profit of $1. The second driveway, I bring in 10 and it only costs me 7, right? Because remember, marginal costs are decreasing at first as we gain efficiency in our inputs. And so that second driveway earned me $3 of marginal profit. The third driveway, 5, and so on and so on. And we can see that up until Even the 7th driveway, although my marginal profit has gone down, it's still positive. So I make $4 on that 7th driveway. So I want to make, remember, we're maximizing profit. I want to make as much money as I possibly can. So I don't want to stop plowing until I have a driveway that breaks even. That happens at driveway number 8. I'll bring in $10 and it costs me $10. So that driveway is the break-even driveway. Every driveway before it earned me a positive profit, and every driveway after it will cause me a loss. So the profit maximizing rule is to choose an output quantity exactly where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. In other words, you'll make as much profit as you possibly can if you break even on your very last unit of output. If a firm is making more revenue on the margin than costs, they should keep going. There's more profit to be had. If a firm is making less revenue than their costs, they need to stop because further activity, further output is going to create a loss. So deciding how to produce is easy if you follow this rule. Mr. Plow will maximize their profits at marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And since he's operating in a perfectly competitive market, the marginal revenue, meaning the money coming in from selling one more unit of output, is simply the price that he sells that output for. And so here, since that price never changes because he's a price taker, the marginal revenue is always equal to the price. So this means that if at the price of $10 graphically, we draw our horizontal line here and we see that Mr. Plow is going to break even at the point where that price curve intersects with the marginal cost curve. At the point A, marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. And so this is the quantity of driveways that Mr. Plow will want to plow. The profit is the area of this rectangle, and we're going to go into that in more detail a little bit later in the second part of this lecture. But the most important thing for you to know now is that you're looking in a table for the place where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. In a graph, you're looking for the place where marginal revenue intersects with marginal cost. So we are going to calculate profit here a little bit differently. Total profit is total revenue minus total cost. So if I wanted to figure out what my marginal profit was, my profit per unit, I would divide by my output quantity. But remember, in an equation, if you do something to one variable in that equation, you have to do the same thing to all the variables in order to keep it consistent. So that means that I would divide my total revenue by my output quantity, and I would divide my total costs by my output quantity. So this is where we're going to see that profit on the per unit basis is actually the price that I sell my product for minus the average total costs for that unit. That's my per unit profit. So if I want to calculate total profit, I would take that number, price minus average total cost, and then multiply that number by the quantity that I've produced. That's where this equation comes from. The little pi symbol represents profit, and it's saying that profit is equal to the difference between my sales price and my average total cost at any given unit times the number of units I've produced. So for example, profit here would be the $10 price minus the average total cost, $8.75. So that's going to be $1.25. And then $1.25 times the 8 units I'm producing is $10. That's how I would calculate my profit for producing exactly 8 units of output. So in class, we're going to pick up with this activity, but I encourage you to think about it right now. Suppose that you're the owner of a firm and you produce jelly beans. Why not? At the average cost per case listed in this table. So initially, you're producing 200 cases of jelly beans per time period. Then you get a call from a customer who wants to place an order for a case. And that requires you to up your output from 200 cases to 201 cases. She offers you $350 for that case. Should you produce it? If we only know average costs here, we've got to somehow take average costs and compare it or turn it into marginal costs. That's your hint. So if you have average costs, the first step is to take that average cost and turn it into total costs. You know how to do that. Then once you have total costs, you can look at your two total cost numbers and calculate the change. That's marginal cost. So this is a two-step process. I encourage you to think about this, and we're going to pick up here in class, thinking about how we could use average cost as a way to discover whether it's worth producing one more unit. That's where I'm going to finish for this part of the lecture. We'll continue with the short run and long run decisions of a firm and look specifically at the graph and how we can use the graph to make good decisions about when we should shut down, when we would stay in business and operate at a loss, or when we would actually be making a profit. So I'll see you next time.